Bluegrass Jamalong is proud to be sponsored by Collins Guitars and Mandolins, each and every one built from the sound up in Austin, Texas. Hi, this is Matt, and you're listening to Bluegrass Jamalong, a podcast for anyone and everyone who loves bluegrass. Hey everybody, welcome back to Bluegrass Jamalong. Got a really fun episode for you this week. I've been chatting to David Grisman. David turns 80 in a couple of weeks. It's also 50 years since the start of the David Grisman Quintet. But tonight what we're going to talk about is 35 years since he founded Acoustic Disc, the record label that he runs and owns. And such a great conversation. Really enjoyed chatting to him. There's so many. I mean, I could have had 5 different chats with David, all of which would have been fascinating and all of which would have taken up an hour of just, glorious conversation. But really enjoyed it. You're going to hear a bit about how Acoustic Disc started, how the label's gone from being a CD label to a digital label, some of the benefits of that, what that allows David to do, the range of music he's put out. We're going to chat a bit about Tone Poems that he put out with Tony Rice and the expanded version of that. Just so much interesting stuff. It's a real treat to get to have this. I really want to thank Craig Miller, David's manager, who's been David's manager for 50 years now, for helping get this together. And thank David for chatting to me. It was really good fun. Here comes my conversation with David Grisman. I hope you enjoy this. Sometimes when I do an episode of the podcast, I say my guest tonight needs no introduction, and that's probably never been more true than it is tonight. But he could also be the kind of guest who has several introductions because he wears so many hats. He's been at the forefront of instrumental string band music for over half a century. He has been a key figure in bluegrass, a huge figure in the mandolin world. He's a composer, he's a record label boss, and everything he's done could easily be an episode in its own right. David Grisman, it's a real pleasure to have you here.
Oh, thanks, Matt. Thanks for having me.
And there are so many things we could talk about. This is about to be your 80th birthday in a couple of weeks. It's 50 years since the David Grisman Quintet first got together. But what we're going to chat about, and I'm really excited about this, is it's 35 years since you started Acoustic Disc.
Wow. Time flies.
Yeah, it does, doesn't it? And it's such a cool thing that you've done with Acoustic Disc. And I'd love to know, before we get into some of the details, just sort of how it came about starting your own label in the first place.
Well, it was total happenstance. I had been recording for MCA Records, and I had a contract that for several records, but I did a live project with Sven Asmussen, a great jazz violinist from Denmark, and they put the record out, but they put a clause in my contract that if I didn't sell, I think 25,000 copies in 9 months, they could drop me.
Wow.
And I guess I sold 19,000. I was ready to make a record, and nothing was happening. And finally found out, well, if you send us a demo of what you want to record, we'll give you an extra 6 weeks while we figure it out. And I told them not to bother with a simple motion of my middle finger. Translated through my manager. In any case, 2 friends, Artie and Harriet Rose, had moved to California where I was living and wanted to start a business there. And this was about the time LPs were going down and CDs were coming up. And so their initial idea was to start a CD store, and I was helping them look into that. But we realized pretty soon that you couldn't really compete with the big one at that time was Tower Records. And So concurrently, I had been building a studio because the studio that I'd been working at, 1750 Arch Studios in Berkeley, had closed down. And one of the engineers there put it in my head that I should acquire all their equipment and build a studio. And he convinced me to do that. And I was building this studio, and I was like being dropped by my record label. I was ready to record a record, and I had two friends that wanted to start a business. So that's what happened. We said, oh, we can start a CD company. And we did. And I made that first record called Dog 90, and it came out in 1990, which you pointed out is now 35 years ago. And my second release, I was very interested in the music of Jaco de Mandolin, who was kind of a master musician from Brazil, mandolin player who was the kind of leading proponent in a genre called choro music. And I had negotiated the rights to his recordings to lease them from RCA Brazil, and was planning to put that out as the second release. And then Jerry Garcia came over for a visit and suggested we make a record. And I told him I just built a studio and started a record company. And he said, great, we'll do it for you. So that was the easiest contract negotiation in history of my history. And anyhow, we started recording that very day, and that ended up being our second release, and that kind of catapulted us. Actually, the first two releases were nominated for Grammys. So we were batting 1,000 there for the first year. But anyhow, that's how it got started.
And that's fascinating, because just those three releases, that sort of contains the seed of what Acoustic Disc has grown into. It's kind of, on one hand, putting out your new music, also music of people you've collaborated with over the years, and also finding interesting music from elsewhere and making that available. And those sort of three strands have really run through all of the past 3.5 decades in Acoustic Disc, haven't they?
That's a very astute observation on your part.
Because it's an interesting label for some. I mean, even just talking about 1750 Arch, like there's a whole chunk of string band history happened in those rooms and on that equipment, and some amazing music came out of there. And it's great to hear that equipment was still being used. Right.
It's well, probably it's all faded into the sunset and been replaced by now. Because right now we've become all digital, and just I've tripled my producing output since my wife Tracy and I acquired the full ownership of the company in 2020. And partners wanted to retire, and so we took the leap of faith. And coincidentally, the pandemic came in right about that time, and kind of just decimated my touring business or activities. And but we had a new endeavor to operate this company, and we quickly decided that since physical CDs were not really viable commodity, and we really didn't want to, we had been doing digital releases for, I guess maybe 10 years. I read a book about 25 years ago called The Future of Music, which kind of predicted what would happen. And so I really wanted to get on board the download facet of it. And it took several years to get that happening in the early stage. But by 2020, we were able to convert or build a new website that could handle all of that. And so that took about 6 months, and then we're off to the races here. And I try to put out a new release every month.
We'll be right back with you just after this. The long-awaited Hill Country series from Collins Guitars represents a new voice in their acoustic lineup. Rooted deep in the bluegrass world, these new Dreadnought NOM models feature a strong fundamental tone with a dry, warm and woody character that's sure to catch the attention of players who hold the vintage instruments of the 30s in their highest regard. Watch world-class pickers Jake Workman, Kenny Smith and Bob Minner perform with new Hill Country instruments on the Collins Guitars YouTube channel, and learn more at collinsguitars.com. Wow. And I guess if you're not tied to, and that's when it's extraordinary just thinking about that when Acoustic Disc started, CDs were just starting to get a proper foothold in the market. And people were still buying LPs, people were still buying tapes, but CDs were definitely in the ascendancy. And to sort of look now at, this pretty much entirely digital label.
Although LPs are selling more than CDs right now, but it's just too beautiful a concept to be able to just make one copy or one product and then be able to sell an infinite number of them without manufacturing anything. So it's just, and plus, we put out a lot of what I call high definition versions of these projects and expanded versions of earlier projects that we call deluxe edition with added material and at a higher resolution than CDs. So it's kind of a win-win situation, and music sounds better. We can put out more of it. And, the customer gets the music right away. We get paid right away. And it's just a beautiful concept.
You don't have all your money tied up in stock, which is a bonus, right?
Right. That's all the kind of negative parts, which I never really, my partners were really engaged with that aspect of the business. But that's where the headaches begin, how many to make, and the fact that it's a consignment business, and they can get lost, they can get broken, they can get returned. It's kind of a nightmare for a musician.
And it feels like it plays right into the sweet spot of getting your music out there, because it feels, just from the amount of stuff there is, it feels like you're somebody who's always recorded a lot, like regardless of whether it's a specific studio product. Like there's just so much stuff. It feels like the tape was running for most of your creative life by the amount of stuff that's come out.
Well, my big inspiration was a man named Ralph Rinsler, who was actually a neighbor of mine and growing up in Passaic, New Jersey. And my mom was his art teacher. He lived 4 blocks away, and he was a fantastic mandolin player. He was in the Greenbrier Boys, which was the first bluegrass band in New York City. And he was a folklorist, really a Renaissance man. He discovered Doc Watson and brought the tapes. I brought tapes back, and I was sitting in his kitchen at the age of 15. And he said I was the first person to notice Doc's playing because he was on a recording of Clarence Ashley, who was an old-time banjo and guitar player, would recorded in the 20s. And Ralph had rediscovered him and went to Tennessee to record him. And Doc Watson was one of his neighbors who ended up on the recording. And I kind of went from I had discovered bluegrass music around that time and was smitten with it. And this incredible person took me and 2 fellow misfits from junior high school, from the ground floor to the penthouse, so to speak. And it was a very great experience that's continuing to this day. And I got onto the idea that, well, this is music you can record with one microphone. And I had, my mom had given me a Wallensack tape machine, and I started recording stuff, off the radio. And I've always been, I guess, a collector or an archivist,
Well, that's one of the beautiful things about Acoustic Disc is it is sort of an archive, but it's also an onward moving, growing, living. It manages to be both at the same time, which is such a fascinating thing. Like labels tend to be one thing or the other, and it manages to be this sort of archive and continuing breeding ground for, David Grisman music, but also all the things that you're interested in. So the history of the mandolin, or the history of recording, or all these things that just, you reach out and pull into that. And there's an extraordinary catalogue there.
I'm glad you appreciate that. I've always been into the history of, where things come from. And, when I got interested in bluegrass and decided I wanted to play the mandolin, I just was fascinated by the progression of, American, of that music, how it grew from, what they call old time folk music that started being recorded in the 1920s, largely through the efforts of a man named Ralph Peer, who convinced RCA Victor to let him record some of this rural roots music. They had been like the largest classical music label in the world, and he got this brilliant idea to record people like the Carter family and Jimmy Rogers and the Stoneman family, and it just took off, especially in the South. And I got interested in all of that, and I wasn't alone. People like Jerry Garcia and Bob Dylan, and there were little pockets of kind of kindred spirits of young people that were interested in the traditional American music. And,
Well, and that the sort of the roots of it all, and how much of a crossover there was between, like, there wasn't this marketing distinction between this is blues, this is bluegrass, this is like American music in the sort of pre-war years felt like it all came out of one. It all sort of crossed over, and there's jazz wasn't separate from everything.
Well, they did actually. The major labels did kind of try to establish. Blues was called Race Records, and they were marketed to different aspects of society, but there's something in the American musical spirit that appreciates. It's very eclectic. I mean, there are people that just only want to listen to, country blues or rhythm and blues, or, now there's a new genre every day, but, the music that interests me is music from, the early part of the 20th century, or the first half primarily, because it came out of, I guess, a more real circumstance. With the advent of recording around 1900, and radio and records were developing technologically as well as aesthetically, I guess you could say. The business aspect started becoming a big influence on the music until, it finally achieved one of its goals was to make music a disposable commodity, which I disagree with strongly. I think great art is timeless, and it shouldn't be you throw out yesterday's biggest hit, but that's what it's turned into, which, I just don't participate in that. I think there's music and art that's important, and the fact that we can develop digital releases enables us to make this stuff available, even though it may only sell 50 copies. Whereas you couldn't really think that way if you're manufacturing something. You could, but you couldn't stay in business that way.
And that's really interesting, is that sort of need the industry has to sort of churn and make things new all the time. And, when through the sort of 50s, 60s, 70s, when there was this catalogue of classic music that people just had, and, and people started talking about classic rock or kind of whatever. So the record companies just started inventing new formats to make us buy it all again. Like, if you're not going to buy new music, you have to buy the old music again. And it's just like, but there's something really beautiful about finding a rehearsal tape from the 70s or a live show of Tony Rice and Wyatt doing some duets and being able to go, we'll just put this out for those people that are interested in it. Right.
I keep finding things all the time. I really recorded, once I started playing gigs and touring, I just tried to get everything recorded. And, the last thing I would do after coming back from several weeks of playing gigs would be to listen to it all. So I have, boxes of tapes that I still haven't even really delved into. And, for example, and I have a great engineer comes over about once a week and we work on various things. I've always got 5 or 6 projects in the works. And recently one of my big mandolin heroes and somebody that taught me a lot and spent a lot of time with me when I was young was a guy named Frank Wakefield, who passed away this past year. A great mandolin player, and showed me a lot and taught me a lot. And I was contacted by his partner, and who expressed interest in, having us release anything that I might have. And I realized I had several tapes of Frank in the basement, my basement, playing the mandolin with me backing him up on guitar. And I hadn't heard this stuff for over 50 years. And my recollection was, I suck on guitar. But, it's over like 60 tracks and I hung in there pretty good with him. And he's kind of at his peak during that period. And, they're home recordings, but the music is there, And so I have a lot of things of that nature that I keep discovering, and I have the means to distribute it. And, a lot of people are interested in that. And some people appreciate the fact that, there's a different vibe to recordings like that, which is just very far removed from, commercial recordings of today or 30 years ago. I mean, been on this path of, pulverizing whatever elements there were of rock and roll or blues or jazz into just some kind of homogeneous ilk. I don't know how to describe it. I'm just not into it. I think there was a lot of great music that was more or less invented in this country, and I like to start making hats saying "Make music great again." Anyhow,
I think, and it's really interesting what you were saying there about the nature of those recordings, because listening to a whole bunch of stuff in preparation for this, and like hearing you with Doc or with Tony or with Jerry or whoever, so many of those recordings feel like they're so intimate. They feel like you're just sitting on the sofa while two people play in the corner of the room next to you. And they're not, and particularly as, you know, as string band music got more developed, and you're not necessarily going to get people doing a commercial record full of those kinds of songs. Like just listening today to the complete tone poems, and there's a take of Bill Cheatham on there that's just sort of in between other stuff.
Oh,
it wasn't,
right.
You know, and it's just brilliant. And but it's not necessarily the kind of thing you sit and plan to put out on your record.
Right. Well, you know, when I built my own studio, it was, you know, most professional commercial recordings that I took part in, you know, you showed up at a studio and there was a producer and an engineer and the artist, and it was all very businesslike, and, you know, you did whatever task was at hand and then fill out a form and goodbye, you know. And when I built my own studio and Jerry started coming over, we just set up the microphones and played stuff, and, you know, oh, let's do that again. I mean, there was no deadline. There was no pressure. There was, it was like being in your living room, more or less. And some of these things were recorded in living rooms and kitchens. And, you know, I just, when digital audio tapes came into being, and they were 2 hours long, and the engineer could just slap one in the thing and just keep it rolling, you know. I mean, that's as analog recording faded into the sunset, more or less. You know, multi-track tapes, 1-inch and 2-inch tapes got to be very expensive. I mean, and I, for a long time, would record at 30 inches per second. And so basically, you know, most of my multi-track recordings were made on a 1-inch 8-track machine, my 3M M23, which Les Paul told me was the best machine they ever made. At 30 inches per second, you know, you would spend like $65 for 15 minutes. And, you know, now it's just gigabytes on your hard drive. Anyhow, in the digital audio tape, I mean, so I was always into, you know, capturing the commentary and the, you know, talking and joking around, and a lot of spontaneity. And, you know, I mean, when I started recording, you know, if you had 3 minutes left on a reel, oh, better change the reel, you know, because it's going to run off. Or let's go over that last take so we have enough tape for the next song. And I mean, I remember sessions where, well, we have 5 minutes left. Let's do another song. And but without those constraints, I think it was more relaxed. And I think it produced, in a lot of ways, better music.
And it was interesting listening to the complete tone poems, because like part of me thought, I don't need 4 hours of 5 takes of this and 5 takes of that, and like 20 minutes of different versions of Turn of the Century or whatever. Yeah. But as soon as I started listening, I was just like engrossed. And part of it is the chat and just hearing Tony's voice and your voice, and you're kind of nudging each other in the direction you want to record in, and, you know, just little, even innocuous bits like, oh, should we do one more today? Well, I've got blisters on my fingers, maybe not, you know. And it's an extraordinary insight into like making those records. It's like having a whole extra like audio booklet almost of information you can listen to for context, and I love all that stuff. I can go down rabbit holes for forever on things like that.
I'm so glad to hear you say that. Yeah, I mean, one of the things I've observed is really the world doesn't really need any more music, recorded music, because, I mean, for example, I have like 112 CD set of complete works of Mozart. You know, I haven't even probably listened to 20% of it, and, there's so much great music that's been produced, and now due to various formats, it's all available. You can instantly buy the complete works of Duke Ellington or Benny Goodman or Shostakovich or the Stanley Brothers. I mean, it's all available. Back when I got interested in this stuff, man, it was hard to find. You couldn't, there were very few bluegrass recordings and recordings in general. They used to put out a new single, 78 RPM single every 6 weeks. And of course, the last one would go out of print. And where do you find something like that, But now, say 50 years later, there are compilations of everything Bill Monroe ever recorded, and complete with a lot of outtakes, because major labels kind of, when CDs appeared, they had like an 80-minute capacity, whereas LPs were like pretty much maximum 45 minutes. So, a lot of companies started, we've got extra takes from this John Coltrane session that nobody's ever heard. Let's put it on there, So, because people that are really passionate about music, I mean, if you love Miles Davis or Jimmy Martin, you want to hear it all, and or at least have it all available, or as much as possible, or more than was originally released. So sort of it's a fortuitous that I kept all this stuff. And, I realized at a certain point that this isn't doing anybody any good just sitting on my shelf or in a box. I have the ability to put it out. And so I've added to a lot of, like you're saying, that Tone Poems was originally one CD, but we recorded for 4 days or something and did multiple takes and tried out different tunes that were never released. And, going back over it, I mean, how bad can it be, I'm not the greatest, but Tony Rice was, and, it's pretty consistent. And, we just put out 3 volumes of duo recordings of Jerry Garcia and myself that were largely unissued takes and tunes from sessions where it was just the two of us. And we called it Bare Bones and found over 50 tracks. So, hey, I know there's some people that are interested in hearing that. And one thing I've observed in my own listening is, I was very passionate about Bill Monroe, and, he was familiar with all of his issued stuff, but a label called Bear Family, which you're probably familiar with, from Germany, originally West Germany, and they put out a lot of music, American music, that was no longer or never even released in the United States, and they put out several beautiful box sets of Bill Monroe's recordings, and the classic original bluegrass band with Bill Monroe and Lester Flatt and Earl Scruggs and Chubby Wise. That's like the prototype of bluegrass music. They put out a whole disc of unreleased alternate takes, and that was mind-blowing because, I've been listening to, Summertime is Past and Gone, I'm Going Back to Old Kentucky, just one version with one, set of mandolin solos, one band, and then to hear like the next take, it was completely different, at least if you're getting into the weeds on this stuff and really listening. That's another thing I've noticed is I used to think, well, if people could just hear Django Reinhardt, they'd all start listening to that. But it's not true, because what I call listening is not what a lot of people do. It's like background. It's like wallpaper. You don't really notice it. It's there. But I've always paid attention to music and noticed things. And I guess that's the thing musicians do. And I'm not really advocating that everybody study what they're listening to. But for those that do, and like yourself, you pick up on, wow, there's Bill Cheatham. That wasn't on the record. Or here's an alternate take of this tune. Yeah, that's different because I'm used to hearing this one version, and now here's 3 other versions.
Well, and all the fascinating sort of chat about the instruments themselves. There's a point Tony's talking, I think, about the sort of Gibson guitar that's got a sort of scroll on it, and he's going, "What is this thing? I'm starting to like this," and and it's just, and that's all because it's a project that it fascinates me on 2 levels because. Tone Poems is fascinating. Just you can sit with the booklet and look at all the instruments, and that's amazing. But also, it sort of teaches you, regardless of what the instrument is, tone comes from the player. Like it's amazing how Tony sounds on all of those instruments, and how you sound on all of those very different mandolins. And so it's an extraordinary listening exercise just for that.
Yeah, I've noticed through the years, people always say, "Oh, that mandolin sounds really good. That guitar sounds really good." And of course, that's funny. I don't hear anything. They never say you sound really good. Yeah. But that's been another really side interest of mine is that instruments themselves, and that's a whole other story of these instruments that were used in the acoustic instruments that were used in bluegrass and old time country music and blues. Is their story is very fascinating too, and I've gotten observed that, and through the years have come to realize what that whole thing is kind of about, the development of Martin guitars or Gibson mandolins or, Gibson banjos or Vega banjos or, and all the, kind of instruments that were kind of oddball experiments that kind of fell by the wayside during the development of, American stringed instruments up till today. But there's kind of a golden era, and it's really rooted in old world craftsmanship. A lot of immigrants who built violins and guitars in other countries came here and were hired by companies like Martin and Gibson to develop these things, which are, our voices. If you're an instrumentalist, the instrument is your voice, really. And that's all been very fascinating. And I still keep up with it,
Well, it sort of feels really fitting that those instruments have such a sort of rich history in the immigrant kind of experience in America, because just listening back to, American music in the first half of the 20th century, and particularly looking at some of the releases that you've put out and, what an immigrant thread there is running through American music, and even some of the things that aren't necessarily that well known. One of the first things I bought from Acoustic Disc was the 2 CD set you did from Dave Apollon.
Oh, great! Yeah.
And just that, this is music that you hear you hear the Europeanness in it, and yet it's definitely a big part of that bridge between that music becoming American music as well.
Yeah. Did you get the second volume of that? Yeah. Have you heard that Tenor Madness release?
Yeah.
That's another kind of tone poem sort of thing. That's got over 50 instruments on it. And I really learned a lot from kind of doing that project and researching the development of those instruments, because they were really came out of a very transitional period in American music and recording technology, which interacted with the music as well. So it's all tied together if you care to study it, you know.
And that's it, I think, with all of them. I mean, this is sort of what this podcast is. It's me finding things interesting and pulling on threads and seeing where they lead and then seeing where they lead. And it's all tangled together and it all goes off in different directions. And it's endlessly fascinating.
Well, I'm glad that you're that interested in this stuff. And hopefully you'll turn some other people onto it. You know, that's the one area that I feel inadequate in, is trying to, you know, capture the attention of potential fans of all of this stuff, because you know, most people, you know, are occupied with their, you know, their daily lives, and the music they're aware of is largely commercial music that they hear on, you know, wherever they hear it. You know, it isn't this usually, I would imagine, but anyhow, I appreciate the interest, and I think there are a lot of people out there that would fall in love with a lot of this stuff.
Just going through the catalogue, you know, in advance of this, one of the things that sort of piqued my curiosity was the it's the record that you put out that had been, can't remember what label it came out on first, but it's the Peter Ostrusko and Bertram Levy.
Oh record. Yeah, great. Yeah, well, Bertram is a neighbor of ours here in Port Townsend, Washington, and I've gotten to know him in the past dozen years or so, and he's quite an amazing guy. I mean, he plays banjo, he plays concertina, he studies bandoneon, goes to Argentina once a year, and he builds boats, and he's a urologist, or a retired urologist. I mean, he's a real Renaissance man himself. And this is he's done records for various labels. This one was from Flying Fish originally on LP, and he gave me a copy of it, and it was really great stuff. And that's another thing, you know, a lot of music that came out is just out of print and not available. And, you know, often the hardest part is to like make a deal with somebody, or even finding who to make a deal with. And I've never been wanting to be a bootlegger. And so, you know, there's still projects that I'd love to do. It's just kind of hung up in that netherworld of, you know, where music meets commerce or art meets commerce. You know, it's just, but, you know, I've got plenty to keep busy. One of my things I'm working on now, have you ever heard of Giovanni Vicari?
No.
He's an Italian-American string virtuoso who started recording in 1928. You've probably seen him because he plays the mandolin in the wedding scene in The Godfather.
Right.
And he was a great mandolin player, tenor banjo player, guitar player, and violin player, and did a lot of recording. And about 8 or 9 months ago, I was contacted by his son, who was wondering if we'd like to put out his father's music. And so there's well over 100 tracks that I'm working on. And it's really amazing stuff, you know, through the late 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. I mean, this guy's an amazing player. And pretty much very few people have heard of him or heard his music. So that's just right up our alley here. And so I'm working on that, among other things. So it keeps me busy.
Well, the other thing that's been keeping you busy that I sort of really enjoyed, and it again speaks to this sort of dual archivist yet kind of vital moving forwards thing, is the whole Dog Tracks project. Because it's
the Dog Works?
Yeah, sorry, Dog Works.
Oh, right, yeah.
And it's idea of kind of putting out all your compositions in the order that they were composed. And, you know, it's a wonderful project.
Oh, thanks. I'm glad. You know, they're not, some of the cuts on there were never released, or, you know, different versions than what people might be familiar with. But, and, you know, I may not have gotten every last chronological order correct, you know. But, yeah, that's fun to do. And there's a bunch left. You know, since moving to Washington State, I've written probably close to 40 more tunes. And I keep writing them. Even though I thought I was kind of finished with that years ago, just because I had a very hectic existence touring and going back and forth and, you know, trying to run to the rent-a-car place so that I could be first online to rent a car, checking into hotels and checking out of hotels, and just a lot of activities related to touring and playing music for people that have nothing to do with music and kind of wear you down, especially at my age. So I'm kind of happy to not be doing that.
It's extraordinary how the more kind of commercially successful you get as a musician, the less of your life involves making music.
It could very well be that way. You'd have to really exert a lot of energy in trying to prevent that from happening. And unfortunately, most musicians, you know, the really successful ones get to not have to deal with a lot of that. I mean, they have their own jet plane or whatever. And but most working musicians, you know, got to go through that stuff, you know, to play for maybe 75 minutes. You pretty much have to take 3 days out of your life, one day getting there, one day coming back, and most of that day that you're playing is involved in not playing. But, you know, I don't regret any of it, but I'm glad at this point that I've developed something else that fulfills my aesthetic impulses, and I don't have to drive to the airport and sit in the airport and get on a plane and go through all of that just to play for 75 minutes, although I miss the music part of it. But I'm going to do 2 concerts. My son Sam, who's become a band leader in his own right, he has the Sam Grisman Project, and he kind of engineered a concert in Seattle on March 25th, which is going to be devoted to my music. And he's assembled a band of to more or less replicate the instrumentation of my original quintet. And then I'm going to play a bunch of these new compositions that no one's heard. And a lot of my alumni and musical friends are going to show up and be part of that. So that's exciting for me.
And will you record that, do you think?
Yeah, I think they're going to live stream it, but they haven't announced that yet. They're hopefully, yeah, it'll all all get recorded. I hope I can handle it. You know?
Sounds great. And well, it's interesting because you sort of talk back to that original quintet, and we're talking about, you know, releasing all of this music and bringing things out of obscurity and re-releasing things. But the one thing that doesn't seem to be available is that first David Grisman quintet record. And is that a kind of rights and contracts issue, or is there another reason for that?
Yeah, I just don't, you know, there's several of my recordings that I don't own the rights to. Now, I have a manager of over 50 years, Craig Miller, and he's working on trying to get those rights back for a few of those projects. But, yeah, I don't know even who owns that now, but the company I did that for, Kaleidoscope, they went out of business, and I think they sold it to another company that went out of business, you know.
Yeah.
It's not a pretty picture sometimes, but I'm working on it.
Well, I mean, it's that record is such a milestone for so many of us in terms of just, I'm particularly interested in like progressive instrumental string band music, you know, in all its forms. And it feels like that was the first real attempt anybody had done to do something progressive that was all instrumental.
Well, you know, I could certainly say that, you know, the Quintet of the Hot Club of France was pretty progressive, at least in its day. And, you know, there are people that, you know, Jethro Burns, there was a series of records or recordings made by the String Dusters, which was Jethro Burns and Chet Atkins and Dale Potter on fiddle. You know, music is a continuum. You know, it's a process. It's always moving, and it's always developing and changing. And so, you know, just due to the magnitude of the influence of the music business, you know, it's hard to say any one thing is, you know, hey, I'm glad I'm a spoke in the wheel, or a, you know, link in the chain. But I came along at a good time, and I was fortunate enough to meet a lot of great people who encouraged me and taught me things, and I try to do the same for future generations, or, you know, young people. And there are a lot of young people that are interested in this. There is a tendency for all young creative people to want to kind of reinvent the wheel. And I think that's not possible, really. That's where history comes in. And I strongly believe that you should study history and even emulate things from the past. You know, there's a museum in St. Petersburg, Florida, that's totally devoted to exclusively the works of Salvador Dali. And it's like one big room, and you start at one corner, and it progressively, you see the development of Dali chronologically. And you can see that he started out imitating various, you know, here he imitates Picasso, here he imitates, you know, the Impressionists, and he doesn't really start to emerge as what we know as Salvador Dali until after about 10 years. And, you know, that's the way I started. I just wanted to learn to play like my heroes, Bill Monroe and Frank Wakefield and Jesse McReynolds and Bobby Osborne, and I just was trying to copy what they did. And fortunately, after a certain point, I started wondering, why am I doing this? They're already here, you know, and fortunately, this other thing emerged. And one thing I copied was, oh, they write original tunes. Maybe I should try and write original tunes. And so it's all rooted in the past, so there can be no future without the past, and studying the past. And on in almost every facet of life, it's good to know what came first or before.
Well, I think that sort of like brings us full circle in this conversation in terms of what Acoustic Disc does, because it preserves a lot of the past for people, but it also charts your development from rehearsals in your living room through to, and all those different bits, whether it's making music in an intimate setting with one or two people or the band, or, there's just so much there for people to study. And it's been like a remarkable thing that you've achieved with that record label, and it's still going strong, and a release a month is an extraordinary thing. And we're all the richer for it, I think. And I just want to thank you for taking the time to talk to me about it.
Well, thank you for talking to me about it and for your interest. And I'm sure you'll help spread the word. It's acousticdisc.com. And we get on our mailing list. And every week, every Wednesday, we put out what we call a treat of the week, a free track that you can download from one of our releases. We still haven't gone through them all. Been doing this about 3 years. And today's treat is from a Dog Nilo. Have you heard that one?
Yeah.
With Danilo Brito. It was a great mandolinist from Brazil who is really preserving the style of Jaco do Bandolim. I think he's arguably the greatest living exponent of that style.
Well, we'll put a link in the show notes so people can go and sign up for that, and go and check out the catalogue as well. Thank you so much. This has been great.
Well, keep up the good work, and I appreciate your interest in what we're doing.
Bluegrass Jamalong is proud to be sponsored by Collins Guitars and Mandolins, each and every one built from the sound up in Austin, Texas.